So, in 2011, the Leveson Inquiry was initiated to investigate the practices of the British media after journalists at News of the World, owned by Rupert Murdoch, found to have hacked the mobile phone of murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler. Led by Judge Sir Brian Leveson, the inquiry was tasked to look into the culture, practices and ethics of the press. The second phase was planned to investigate the relationship between journalists and the police. Now, Leveson has been on hold since 2018, but Jeremy Corbyn, who was leader of the Labour Party at the time, pledged to go ahead with the inquiry. It is now emerged that Labour has now dropped their commitment to pursue the second phase of the investigation. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy has hinted that the second part of the Leveson inquiry, known as Leveson 2, is unlikely to proceed. Asked about the status of Leveson 2, which was put on hold by the Tories in 2018, Miss Nandy said, well, it's not something that we committed to in the manifesto. So, why have Labour seemingly ended their commitment to continue the inquiry? Well, this next paragraph is it's quite telling. The Sun and the Sunday Times backed Labour at this month's general election after News UK received private assurances that a Starmer-led government would not pursue Leveson 2 or introduce restrictions on press freedom. I understands. Lachlan Murdoch, the head of parent company News Corp, approved the endorsement after meeting with Sir Keir Starmer and his team. Kevin, I mean, surely this is none other than barefaced corruption and political bribery. I know we don't like to throw that term around, but in this case, surely it is.
It can't be seen in any other light, I don't think. It's a direct correlative function, right? He previously had supported the policy when he had seemingly some semblance of principle under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, as you pointed out. And now Keir Starmer has directly contacted with Lachlan Murdoch, the Nepo baby who now runs Rupert Murdoch's empire, directly given the concession that Leveson 2, which was going to look into the criminality and involvement with News International and other organisations with the British police, which I, for one, as a citizen, would love to see, because clearly criminality took place there and lots of people need to be held accountable for it. And in return for that, he got the approval and endorsement of News International, both the Times and the Sun, albeit mutedly so and at the last minute. But either way, he got that endorsement. It's a one-for-one quid pro quo exchange, and one of the most corrupt, blatantly corrupt acts in recent sort of political history, and is the ultimate sign of what everyone, I think, on the left knew to be the case, but a lot of centrist melts denied, that he intends to govern on behalf of and for the rich and powerful.
Well, back when Corbyn was Labour leader, I mean, he was pretty clear on media reform. It's something that we obviously desperately need, and this is why we're doing what we're doing. But we don't have a free press. We have a billionaire-owned press. Now, even so-called liberal outlets such as The Guardian, overwhelmingly, our journalists are privately educated. They all know each other, and it's just a club. But many of the media were trying to say that Corbyn was Trumpian for attacking it, essentially saying that he doesn't like media accountability, he doesn't like scrutiny. But to compare Corbyn to Trump in that regard is mad. I mean, Trump and his supporters genuinely hate media scrutiny. I mean, everything is fake news unless these outlets support them. But Jeremy Corbyn wanted media reform, a more pluralistic and open media, not just billionaire-owned. So if you ask me, being in cahoots with media barons, changing policy on the whims of billionaires, that's more Trumpian than anything Corbyn ever did. I mean, do you agree with that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. The idea that it's the pro-Leveson side that want to avoid scrutiny is absolutely ludicrous. Leveson itself was meant to be scrutiny of the media. And you can see from the way in which the independent, the IPSO, the IPSO, the replacement for the Press Complaints Commission, which has never been officially recognised, but is funded by all of the billionaires who own all of these newspapers, has been routinely criticised by both the National Union of Journalists and by independent non-governmental organisations as being essentially an incredibly corrupt and corrosive way of them avoiding their responsibility, which Leveson was supposed to bring forward, right? And so the political establishment, through the media and politicians, have essentially kneecapped Leveson and avoided any actual scrutiny of those in positions of power, i.e., billionaires. It's ludicrous that it's being portrayed as politicians trying to avoid scrutiny, when it's actually the politicians and the journalists who have conspired to avoid scrutiny of all of them. Because I think the point you made there of it being a kind of boys' club where everyone knows each other is perfectly exemplified by the fact that the organ with which the interview was given by Lisa Nandy was in the House magazine, which is literally an in-house parliamentary rag, for want of a better word, where politicians talk to other politicians in other media figures and decide what the narrative is going to be. And once that's been decided, it's just gone along with by everybody. Both sides now agree Leveson and scrutiny of the press and criminality don't need to exist, even though we're told that law and order is really important, apparently, but not when it comes to the media.
I mean, that's a really good point you brought up there, because whenever people talk about the role of the media in society right now, you've got two issues here. One, like I call it the billionaire press, because you've got essentially a handful of people owning the means of communication. And then you've got the BBC, which isn't owned by billionaires, but it's a revolving door between the BBC and many figures in government, right?
Yeah.
And when you criticize that, when you say, I don't think this is actually a free press, again, what Jeremy Corbyn did, their response is to kind of say, well, you don't like media scrutiny. But you brought up a really good point. And the point is, the media and the politicians are on the same side. They're supposed to be on opposite sides. I understand you're going to have some sort of friendly rapport with some journalists, of course, but that's far away from what we have today, when you've got the same people going to the garden parties, you've got the New Statesman, you've got the Spectator. They're all in it together, really. And we want to kind of separate that so we can actually have proper media scrutiny. I also thought it was a really good point when you said about law and order. Keir Starmer is someone who's definitely tried to be more conservative on law and order, and when it comes to, I don't know, arresting Just Stop Oil activists, and I know that those policies came from the Tory government, but there's no sign of it slowing down. When it comes to crime, he's clamped down on that, but when it comes to actually powerful people in the media, he's not interested. So, I mean, surely we should call into doubt Keir Starmer's consistency here.
Oh, 100%, yeah. Exactly, yeah. He and his government, like you say, although they didn't institute the policy, are in support of the draconian as hell sentences that were handed down to people who talked about causing a public nuisance. That apparently is beyond the pale, whereas hacking the phone of a murdered child and giving false hope that that child might still be alive, apparently that doesn't need to even be looked into, let alone anyone be prosecuted for it. The double standard is grotesque. And again, if you just look at the basics of it, who are they going to be governing on behalf of? The mood music says so far, the rich and powerful. He's already said he's not going to tax the rich. He's now saying he's not even going to look into the malfeasance of the rich. It doesn't look good. And a further point from the interview with Nandy was that she meant or hinted about the privatization of the BBC as well, which isn't even being really reported as part of this story. But she mentioned that the government had stuck to their manifesto pledge of saying that the BBC charter will go until 2027, which it's due to, and then be either renewed or not. And then she's going to, quote, look at all of the options available with relevant stakeholders, which is essentially a privatization, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. That's what's being done there. If they had no plans on privatizing it, you wouldn't need to say that. You'd say we'd look at ways of furthering the franchise. We'd look at ways of deepening the public institution of the BBC. But they don't say that. They say basically, we like with the NHS, we want closer ties with the private industry. That's what they want. It's privatization by the back door again.
Well, I mean, yeah, when I was reading the article about her comments on Leveson, she did talk about ownership, but the way she tried to frame it was like a closer tie between the public and the BBC. But we already have a publicly funded BBC. I mean, there's some reforms that could be made, but it's really worrying that Lisa Nandy, who was seen as the soft left, is not shooting that down. Now, what I find really interesting is that a lot of the centrist melts, as we like to call them, talk about how the conservatives are corrupt, how they're scandalous, and actually now we have the grown-ups in charge. It's quiet now. It's all so quiet now that Labour are in power. And I've long said that just because it's the Labour Party, it doesn't mean they're any less scandalous. And this is an example of a scandal, right? We've seen examples of it before. We've seen when Keir Starmer has taken quite a bit of freebies, going to football matches and stuff, etc., etc., and then actually having the most freebies from every Labour government combined, Labour Party leader combined. One in terms of a tax, I think it was they were looking at taxing Google, then got a nice little freebie, was taken to an event, and then suddenly dropped that. These things are scandalous, which aren't reported in the media. Now, if it was the Conservative government, you would see it far more in the likes of The Guardian, The New Statesman. You would see it maybe even on the BBC, but because it's Keir Starmer, it's not. Why is that? Why are we suddenly excusing pretty poor behaviour when it's Sir Keir instead of Rishi Sunak?
Well, it's the sensibles. They're back in the room. The adults are back in the room. He's got the good vibes, whereas the Tories had lost the good vibes. And that's at least in part because of Liz Truss. What you've got to look at is who makes the media and what are their goals or what are their stimuli. And that is essentially their own self-interest to a certain extent. They were fine with the Tories being really, really corrupt for a decade. It wasn't until Liz Truss destroyed the economy and hurt their financial interests and indeed their connections in the Conservative Party, who are making themselves very, very unpopular and will lose governing power, that they all of a sudden switched, and now all of a sudden it's Keir Starmer who has the good vibes. And so his corruption can go completely unnoticed until he loses the vibes, and then the great noticing will happen again. And again, I'm less bothered by him going to the occasional football match, although that's still sort of corruption, but it's kind of petty corruption that I think we can basically handle. That's not the end of the world. It's like you say, going to an event with Google, then dropping the tax that Google had to pay. It's going to the meeting with Lachlan Murdoch, and then dropping a central pillar of what was supposed to be reform of the media. It's these levels, this corruption, which is really corrosive and toxic, from a government who pledged change, vote for change, and yet it's literally business as usual. Lachlan Murdoch was already in control of the Tory party before, and he's now in control of the Labour Party. So there's no change whatsoever. The same people are governing. The same people are governing the government, regardless of the party that's in power. So there's no change happening.
But that was kind of the pitch to a lot of people. Or maybe it was a pitch to the journos, the inside journos, which is that, okay, the policies might not change. And we knew that. When we looked at the policies that Labour have been talking about or offering, weren't very different from the Conservatives. But, as you said, the adults in the room, it's going to be a clean government, it's going to be a quiet government, and things are going to change. But even in terms of playing by the same rules, it's exactly the same. Yeah. We understand that they don't want to invest in the economy. They've got their fiscal rules. They won't scrap the 2-child benefit cap. The policies remain the same largely. I mean, even the NHS in terms of privatisation. But it was supposed to be the statesman in charge. It was supposed to be the adults back in the room, and they would have a far cleaner politics. And we're not seeing any of that. And yet I'm seeing silence from the big Labour supporters or the Labour loyalists or the Starmerites. I mean, surely even by their own consistency, they would be angry, but nothing.
Yeah. No, well, because they've tied their colours to the mast. They have a financial vested interest. In the same way that Laura Koonsberg, giggling along schoolgirlishly to David Cameron and Boris Johnson and all the rest of it, she was the Tory party's client journalist. In the very same way that James O'Brien and various of his ilk are the exact copy of that for Keir Starmer. These people cannot turn their backs on them because that's their bread and butter. In the same way that, I mean, we'll talk about American politics later, the same way that people who have attached themselves to Donald Trump can't realistically distance themselves at that point. They've got the stink on them. So there's no way they can go back. So they just have to go all in. They sink or swim with the boat there, you know? And that level of lack of journalistic integrity runs throughout the system, unfortunately. And it's a shame because there are some very, very fine journalists in Britain who do incredibly good work. But unfortunately, they never get into a position of power because the editorial control is done by the same small group of incredibly shady, corrupt bastards.
Well, our media landscape is kind of like an aristocracy in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
They all literally know each other.
Yeah, absolutely. They're the same private school kids, whether they're in Parliament or whether they're in the editorial suite at the Daily Mail. It doesn't matter. They're all the same people. It's, people, we talk about a free press. In theory, you and I have exactly the same free press as Lachlan Murdoch does. But realistically speaking, when one of them is a billionaire who's been handed the most powerful media organization on earth and other people are born with nothing, that isn't freedom, really. Freedoms in the abstract mean nothing. What about concrete, actual freedoms? When they control the point to the point where when Rupert Murdoch was in power, and I presume Lachlan probably runs a relatively similar thing, he literally has a monthly phone call with the Prime Minister. Regardless of party, he would have a monthly government meeting with the Prime Minister, at least by phone or possibly in person if he was in London, to basically dictate what the government's policies were going to be. Otherwise, his newspapers were going to ravage them. The king doesn't have that kind of power. But Rupert Murdoch / Lachlan Murdoch has / does have that power. And that's not a democracy. That's a joke.
And even though we're talking about mainly the press here, I mean, we're talking about the Sun. For me, actually, they're not even the biggest concern because a lot of people know they're pretty biased. A lot of people know they're sensationalist. To me, the biggest problem is the so-called sensible media or the mainstream media, because I don't particularly think the Sun and the Express are particularly the mainstream media. They're just sort of the angry press. But when we look at the BBC, when we look at the Telegraph, the New Statesman, the Guardian, it's a far more pervasive issue, and we kind of touched upon it, which is that you've got people who are privately educated. It's the same sorts of people. So if you compare the amount of people who are privately educated in the country, which is a minority, but then you look at the statistics in the media, majority of them are privately educated, and that means certain voices are filtered out, and they kind of got their blinkers on, which is why I mean, my analysis here is that a lot of them aren't just batting for Keir Starmer because they know they're kind of being biased. I think they believe that there is an inherent good in establishment progressive figure like Keir Starmer, where they can attack the Conservatives because they've fallen out of favour with the establishment, look like they're for change, look like they're radical by backing someone like Keir Starmer. But they can't see beyond that. I don't know if you sort of want to add to that.
Yeah, exactly. I think the private school thing is the perfect example of the way in which they have an in-group preference. And again, that exists to a degree within everybody. I wish that the working class had such solidarity with one another. Unfortunately, they don't. But that's at least in part because of the media landscape we live in. But yeah, the private school kids, if you look at the way in which the revocation of the tax exempt status for private schools, the one vaguely decent policy that Keir Starmer has ever actually put forward and stuck to, at least for now. Look at the disproportionate amount of press coverage that policy received compared to the number of people it will affect, which is minuscule. I mean, it's a fraction of the already tiny fraction that go to private schools who will be in any way actually affected by that, i.e. you have to pull their kids out of school, because it's literally just the people who are right on the cusp of that would be affected in any way, and most of them aren't, because if you were, you probably wouldn't be sending your kids to private school anyway, because that would be potentially financially dangerous. So we're talking about a tiny number of people affected, but because it affects private school kids, it got a massively disproportionate amount of press coverage. Whereas the non-removal of the 2-child benefit cap, which leaves, was it 400,000 extra children in absolute poverty, affects a far larger proportion of the population, and indeed has a much larger economic impact, regardless of the morality of it and all the rest of it, and yet received scant regard. Or indeed Palestine, which when we've seen 186,000 people murdered by Israel, barely touched at all during the election, because whose interests are the media acting in? Their own, and they're all private school kids. So they looked at the private school thing and not 100,000 dead people or hundreds of thousands of starving children or people, literally nurses and doctors not getting paid to the point where they have to use food banks, again, would affect a much larger group of people, not focused on by the media because it's not them being interested, being affected by it. And you see it constantly. I think I brought up with Helena, a mutual friend of ours, last night, the Danny Finkelstein, member of the House of Lords, member of the media class, private school educated guy, literally saying to a young disaffected person in the Question Time audience, can you just tell me, why on earth would you be disaffected with this? Because he had no idea, because he doesn't live in that world. He's not privy to any of it. He's not affected by the pressures that normal people are. And unfortunately, that sums up so much of the media establishment. They aren't affected by it, so they don't care. They don't talk about it, and it's not an issue.
It's a very good point. It's very well put out, very well put, sorry, that essentially the media talks about their own interests, their own constituent. And if you've got essentially majority of these people in a particular bubble, privately educated, then when politicians do talk about them, and I agree with you, the Labour policy on it wasn't even raising taxes on private schools, it was just ending a tax break, it was just making it more fair. And there was a lot of media attention on that because they are personally affected. But when it comes to working class people, when it comes to junior doctors, when it comes to austerity, these people aren't personally affected. So when they do talk about that, they're not even talking about it from a integrity side. There's no journalistic integrity to find out about these particular stories because it doesn't affect them. But also, a lot of people think that the mainstream media is biased either to the left or the right. But I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the case in general. I think they just have a pro-establishment bias, which is why you can see people in the BBC, people in the press, in the media swing between Labour and the Tories, but they're only swing to Labour, for example, if they're establishment friendly. And I think they've given up on the Tories. They know they were toast at the election, and I guess it's a way of keeping them relevant by not sticking with a dead horse. They're now with their man Keir Starmer. It makes them relevant, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, James O'Brien, don't want to pick on just one, but he is a particular example. Was previously a supporter of Boris Johnson for London Mayor, hated Keir Starmer, again, because he was anti-establishment. And then as soon as the adults were back in the room, he was a big Labour stan. That's it. It's institutionalists. It's people who want the status quo. And again, it's sort of class solidarity from their perspective. This is that they are the institution. They don't want change because they've benefited from the status quo. So why would they, it's turkeys voting for Christmas sort of thing.
And their amount of change they do want, though, is largely insignificant. But it's painted as quite radical.
Or it's like social change, which is good, don't get me wrong.
It is good, but it doesn't particularly change
class reductionist about this.
Yeah, but it doesn't change their standing, does it?
No, exactly. Look, David Cameron introduced gay marriage. We had gay civil partnerships and stuff for a long time, but gay marriage was passed by a Conservative who killed 400,000 people with austerity, or 300,000 people with austerity. So the fact that he's, was slightly nicer to the gays is basically irrelevant to the point that he was an absolute ghoul.
I'm excited to say that Turn Left has significantly grown this year. And with that, we've managed to produce far more ambitious content, interviewing high-profile people. We did a 12-hour live election show. There are multiple people behind Turn Left, but we are still working around our full-time work. But we would love it if this was our full-time. It means we could dedicate so much more and to bring even more ambitious content. So if you've been here from the beginning, or you've only recently become a viewer, if you like what we do, then you can help us out. Please like and share this video. Make sure you drop a comment. We want to hear your thoughts, we want to hear your feedback, and we desperately need more independent media. If you want to see a socialist media alternative thrive, then you could be part of that. So if you can support us on Patreon for £3 or £5 per month, or any one-off donation. We can use that money to upgrade our equipment, to rent out a proper studio, and to start paying ourselves. This is only the beginning. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.